guys were real psychopaths. Drug dealers Shane Coates and Stephen Sugg were two of the most ruthless and violent criminals ever involved in the Irish gangland scene. Their Westies gang, based in Dublin, suburb of Blanchardstown, controlled a massive drugs empire in West Dublin in the late 1990s and early years of this decade. These guys could go from being calm to high order violence like a flick of a switch. They were real psychopaths, said a retired Garda who investigated their activities. Drug users who bought from anybody else in the area were often beaten or tortured.
Yeah.
Street dealers who agreed to sell for other gangs were also dealt with in a similar fashion. In 1999, heroin addict Derek Smiley McGuinness was severely beaten and had his face sliced open with a Stanley knife because he couldn't pay a small debt. A middle-aged addict had her breast cut with a knife and cigarettes stubbed out on her body. Another addict was thrown off a balcony in the Ballymun Flats. Miraculously, he survived. The gang's outrageous violence and drug dealing quickly saw their members becoming priority targets for Gardaí. Coates was ambushed by armed police officers at a safe house in Covan in 2003. He received gunshot injuries in the ensuing shootout, but was able to escape across the fields and eventually made it to Spain. He is later joined by Sugg. They later disappeared in 2004 after leaving their homes in Alicante. Locals who drank in the Brookwood Inn knew where they could and could not sit in that Blanchardstown, Dublin pub. Inside the main door left was the domain of one group only, the Westies gang members. The Glennon duo, Shane Coates, and a handful of muscled henchmen sat there only. Some drank excessively, their language crude, and their manner intimidating.
I know, yeah, I remember.
For more than 3 years, nobody messed with the untouchable gang of drug dealers and armed robbers in their personal kingdom until they started killing each other.
Yeah.
The Glennon duo, Coates and Sugg, were friends since their teens in the working-class Cordoff estate in Blanchardstown. They had robbed cars together and stolen cigarettes. Between the end of 2000 and late 2002, the Glennon duo, the two Suggs and Coates, brazenly stamped their authority on the West Dublin territory. 3 small-time drug pushers were tortured and shot over bad debts. Gardaí believe a large number of people who fell foul of the gang were beaten and tortured with knives, vice grips, and iron bars.
They don't even know how much.
The Glennon brothers would fall out with the Suggs and Coates over drug money. On the 17th of September 2003, a masked gunman walks into the Brookwood pub in Blanchardstown, Dublin, and executes Bernie Sugg. He was 23 years old at the time.
Their bodies were found.
Bernie Sugg was one of the country's most vicious criminals and was described by one of his victims as a psychopath.
Even though
he was the gang's enforcer and would not think twice about killing or maiming anyone who stood in his way.
He is a killer.
He was gunned down in a planned hit in the Brookwood pub in 2003. On the 8th of September 2005, 32-year-old Mark Glennon was gunned down outside his home in Blanchardstown yesterday afternoon. The dead man Mark Glennon, was heavily involved in the drugs trade. He had survived an assassination attempt just 2 weeks ago. His younger brother, Andrew Glennon, 30, was shot dead in Clone, County Meath, in April as part of the feud. By 2003, Suggs and Coates had fled to Spain after a shootout with Garday in County Meath. They disappeared in early 2004 and their bodies were found concreted under the garage floor in the suburb of Alicante in
They were going to be shot
2006.
or that, you know.
Coates and Suggs'
They
associate
looked at
Richard
like
Keogh
the sword you
also
die by
fled
the
Ireland
sword.
after an attempt on his life at the house he had bought for himself and his partner.
By the sword you die by the... Ah, that's it. Ah, ex-husband. Oh, see that? Yeah, Connor is back. He's meant to be fighting in the sphere. That's fighting invasion of Ireland. That's the one I want to do as well. See this shit? No, like, watch. Crime. They're trying to say Conor McGregor.
This story kind of comes full circle.
Listen, right? Before we get into this shit, fucking Connor's not a gangster, yeah. He went to school, probably fucking half of these lads, like, you know, he knows them all his fucking life. But let's hear what they have to say.
For us, but we'll start it with the frantic phone calls we were getting in 2017 from particularly the American media that Conor McGregor was going to be killed by the Kinahan cartel and that he'd left the country, he'd gone to ground. There'd been this bust up in a pub and his father had been punched in the face or his father had been threatened or something. And McGregor was in the sights of Daniel Kinahan.
Yeah, I mean, it was crazy. Like, I think we first published a picture of Graham the Weak Wheeling in 2010 with a chip up his nose.
That's
remember
right.
The picture?
I do remember the picture,
again
yeah.
and again.
Why did he have a chip up his nose?
Well, this is a mystery that remains unsolved. But so
that's one of those cases that your mother would say to you, don't do that because the wind will change and you'll be left like that.
Exactly. So little did you know, 7 years later, that would be the only picture of Graham the Weak Wheeling, and that would become a focus of literally thousands of YouTube, MMA specialists, UFC websites, all focusing in on poor old Graham Wheeling with a chip up his
because
nose.
Of course the story was that Graham Whelan had got into some sort of a set too and that he had been either run from the pub or something and he was furious and he was going to come back to get his revenge.
The basic story was Conor McGregor had been involved in a row with a man known to Graham Whelan, and there'd been a bit of a set to, and that Graham Whelan was furious and he was coming after Conor McGregor with all the might of the Kinahan cartel behind him.
And journalists thought there's something wrong with us because, like, I remember kind of laughing.
He lived through it.
He lived through it, basically. Yeah. So we'll bring it full circle and then we go back. It was a picture.
Yeah. A picture of Graham the Weak Whelan with Conor McGregor's sister, who are now in a relationship. Graham the Weak Whelan has just been released from prison in just a couple of months ago in December after serving a 18-month sentence for money laundering offences connected with the activities of being, so since the infamous drugs bust in the Holiday Inn, which we've spoken about many times, and which that seizure of drugs and the blame that was attached, split a gang and ended up causing the Crumlin Drimnagh feud. So Graham Whelan has been a serious criminal for that long.
So that was
See,
like,
Connor
in
grew up
around
around
1.5
there,
million
so
euro worth of cocaine that was being cut up in the Holiday Inn Hotel.
like he would have
And
went to school.
Graham the Wig
A
Whelan.
lot.
He was only a
him.
17-year-old at the
They
time.
were-
He was probably there was probably more senior criminals there, but he was
There was
still
3 criminals there. There was Graham the Wig Whelan, there was Declan Gavin, who was subsequently murdered, and there was Graham the Wig Whelan's friend.
Griffiths. So
Yeah.
He's calling a few
tragically passed away in recent times as well. So
Irish gangland.
Whelan and Griffiths were found with their hands on the drugs. Gavin was having a lie down in a neighbouring room and was blamed for touting, for telling the police, blamed in the whole thing. And what kicked off was the Crumlin Drimnagh feud. Brian Rattigan
Brian
killed
Patterson.
Brian
Declan
Rattigan
Gavin.
blamed Declan Gavin for this loss. The other side of the feud backed Declan Gavin, and then ultimately it split with Frat Freddie Thompson becoming the main protagonist against Brian Rattigan
after Gavin's death.
So
that was that. So that's how far back and how significant a figure, I suppose, Graham Whelan was.
He sort of earned this respect, I think, as well for how he did his time and didn't make a fuss. And he did, I think it was 6 years in prison for that. When he came out, he became heavily involved in crime and really became part of he was a childhood friend of Liam and David Byrne. Liam and David Byrne are obviously connected through family to Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, and Graham the Wig Whelan became one of the more serious players in
that grouping. Which would ultimately become the sort of the Dublin / Ireland entity of the Kinahan Mafia.
Yeah, and Graham the Wig Whelan was forth to Thomas Bomber Kavanagh over in Birmingham. If there was an attempt to actually charge him at one point here in our organisation, we reported at the time a file was to the DPP. No charges were ever brought. So that
would have been after 2009 when that gangland legislation came in.
Yeah, so that was sort of in the early part of the last decade.
Yeah.
It never happened. He then seemed to end up over in Birmingham, where he was really operating as a sort of right-hand man of Thomas Bomber Kavanagh. And they
feared that legislation for a while, didn't they? Because, of course, it sort of mirrored.
I'm sick of listening to them saying Connor's a gangster. Like, he's not a gangster.
Dowdall, of course, and the harrowing last couple of days. So hello, Mick. How are you doing?
Hello, Paul. And we're doing this pod face to face, which is a rarity.
Highly unusual episode today, yes. Our listeners might not be fully aware, thanks to the wonderful magic of our producer, Kieran Bradley, that we very rarely get to do these interviews in person, and it's a thrill to do them in person. But the demands of our jobs means we're often on the road or we're working from home or whatever circumstances. So we're usually joined over video call, and it's put together in the magic of the studio. But today we're sitting in our office in Talbot Street. Very strange in one sense because it's completely empty.
And the good news is you're within punchable range. So that's great.
Yeah. But not to do these things in person.
Must download the actual full interview. This one's only 2 minutes long, so that's not full.
John Gilligan has been arrested in Spain. The convicted drug dealer was one of 6 people operation in the Alicante area, targeting a gang suspected of sending drugs and pills to the UK and Ireland by post.
The sort of operation he was at would be probably best described as cottage level industry compared to what he had been in his heyday when he was earning millions.
They really flooded Ireland with cannabis. They hit the ground running.
John Gilligan has been arrested in Spain and a firearm seized that police there say is the same type as the gun used in the murder of journalist Veronica Guerin.
He immediately assaulted her.
That was certainly setting up some kind of reckoning.
He was so focused on being wronged, as he saw it, by this journalist who was relentlessly pursuing him.
Miss Guerin, Lord Mason, she never wrote one word about me.
He let himself be led by his rage.
There was such a huge reaction to the shooting of Veronica Guerin that the Criminal Assets Bureau was set up and established within months of Veronica being killed.
Everyone
I
knows
think it was innovative at the time, and I think it still is a shining light.
He tried every trick in the book to try and thwart Cab and to try and keep them away from him.
If you're after John, putting our file together, your inquiries, doesn't matter how long it takes.
Spain again became
light fires on the wall, outside the walls.
It's a very different environment in Spain, the prison system.
To weaken the structure of the wall and then just break it down. Or he used to fish. It's truckers like there. They used to just throw the keys in the letterbox and get the keys out of the letterbox and take all the trucks. But he became...
Nobody in Spain knows who this pint-sized Irish old man is. So that could be challenging.
John Gilligan is one of Ireland's most notorious crime lords.
Well,
he rose to prominence in the early 90s, and his gang was behind the murder of journalist Veronica Guerin. With his recent arrest in Spain, it seems Gilligan's career has come full circle, and he now finds himself operating a much smaller criminal enterprise. Not a far cry from how he began his life of crime.
John Gilligan, or Little John, as he was known, grew up in Ballyfermot in Dublin, and at the age of 12 he left school and started out on his life of crime. He started robbing people. He was very into making money, even at that early stage. And at the age of 14, he joined his dad on a ferry line. And at that stage, apparently, he got involved in a corruption racket with his dad on the ferry line, and they were stealing fares. It was in 1978 that he started out as Factory John.
They carried out, a huge number of break-ins at commercial properties targeting high-value goods like video recorders and television sets, and had stole as much as £1 million worth of goods.
When the Factory gang were in the height of their success, they were carrying out at least one major heist a week, and John Gilligan would carry around a pistol with him. They became known as the Hole in the Wall gang because they would use sledgehammers sometimes to make holes or break holes in factory walls in order to get in there. He would also be able to thwart the security systems. He had truck drivers and security employees on his payroll.
Yeah, from his very early days involved in criminality, he kind of proved he wasn't afraid to use threats of violence, in particular against people, so that they wouldn't give evidence or talk to Gardaí about him. And this obviously became a major tenet of his personality, and he followed this through all the way until the murder of Veronica Guerin.
He was very Machiavellian. He didn't care how he was going to achieve that wealth. He didn't care who he hurt on the way. He would even intimidate witnesses if there were trials coming up. He would intimidate jurors in order to stop trials. And a lot of the prosecutions didn't go ahead because of this.
He was behind a break-in of a large hardware store, kind of a builder supplier type business in Enniscorthy in 1987. And the stolen goods were hidden in a yard in Ballymount. And at the time, the guards had a good idea who they were after, but they didn't catch him in the act. But they actually got him then when he was actually moving the stolen goods from the Ballymount yard, and they were finally able to kind of make some charges stick.
In 1990, he was jailed for 4 years. He was in the Portlaoise maximum security prison, so he really had time to think. At that time, a lot of notorious criminals were in Portlaoise. A number of Martin Cahill's gang, Brian Meehan was in there at the time, Paul Ward was in there. He became very close to Paul Ward and Brian Meehan, and they saw him as their new godfather at the time. So he made a lot of connections. He focused his mind. He decided that at that stage he wanted to embark on a career as a drug baron.
John Gilligan, he's about 14 feet. He's gone down to 5'6".
Prison for John Gilligan, like many criminals of that era, it was their education, much the way some people go to college, to university for 4 years to study. He went to prison for 4 years and learned the tricks of the trade and met other criminals. They would swap information about how to develop drugs networks and how to become more advanced criminals and better criminals, essentially.
And when he was released in 1993, he decided that was it. He was never going back to prison again, that it was for mugs, that it was a major disruption to his quest to gain huge amounts of wealth. And so he embarked on his drug empire, and he would utilize the contacts that he made in Portlaoise prison in order to do that.
He had begun to make some inroads into the drugs game, and he developed a contact in Amsterdam, a Lebanese man who was going to be able to facilitate moving a large shipment of cannabis to Dublin via Cork. So he was putting his toe in the water, so to speak. But when he got out of prison, he was flat broke. He'd no money. But he realized that drugs was the way to go and forget about these Mickey Mouse heists.
John Traynor, or the coach, as he was known, he would have seen himself as a respectable businessman, but he was a con man. He had served time in prison. He knew Gilligan from his time also on the ferry line. He would have been involved in that corruption racket with Gilligan. So he was somebody who knew John Gilligan from an early age. And when John Gilligan left Portlaoise and Cork prison in 1993 and decided he wanted to embark on a drug empire, that he wanted to be a serious player, that he wanted to be a drug baron, he and John Traynor sat down and talked about it. They discussed what type of drugs they were going to import and sell. They looked at heroin, but John Traynor advised him that the courts were too hard on heroin dealers, and even the provos came down hard on those who were dealing heroin. They decided that cannabis would be the less controversial drug.
Traynor recommended they speak to another man by the name of Martin Cahill, known as the General. And Martin Cahill was very eager to get involved in the financing of drug shipments because he was a very wealthy man. And this suited Gilligan and his emerging gang perfectly at the time, because they'd no money, but they knew how to do it. And he was promised he would get this back threefold from the Gilligan gang. Now, he never actually did, because he was murdered before he could be paid back in full.
Gardaí investigating his murder believe this was a professional gangland assassination.
With the death of the General and their debts essentially wiped out, the Gilligan gang saw their profits skyrocket.
They really flooded Ireland with cannabis. They hit the ground running in terms of setting up drug networks, importation, particularly from the Netherlands. And they amassed a huge amount of money. I think it's estimated around 20 million altogether.
There was one occasion when Fatso Mitchell was pulled in by the guards, and when he's been interviewed, he complained that there was reports that he was making 60,000 a week, and he said it was nothing like that. It was only 30,000 a week. I mean, the younger members of the gang were getting known about town. They were hanging out in the trendy nightclubs, doing cocaine, dressing in designer clothes. They weren't shy about advertising how wealthy they were becoming, and they were pretty cocky. They were fairly sure that they were untouchable at that stage.
And while Gilligan's gang were not unique in their blatant displays of wealth, it brought them to the attention of one of the country's leading crime correspondents, Veronica Guerin.
Well, Veronica Guerin came to journalism quite late in life. She had trained and worked as an accountant. She also worked in PR, and for the last 6 or 7 years of her life, she worked as an investigative journalist. She certainly made her mark. She was known to be...
Actually, I just want, for any of you that haven't seen the Veronica Guerin movie, you should go watch it. It's worth a watch. It's a very, very good movie.
Very tenacious and determined.
And the General, if you haven't seen the General, I'll see if I can find a way to get them up, but have a look for them.
Within 2 years, she had become the best known crime reporter in the country. She was drawing attention to the gangs, to the amount of drug dealing that was going on. I don't think Veronica nor the guards at the time had any idea just how much money they were making, but she certainly drew attention to their activities and to the complete ineffectiveness of the legislation at the time and how hard it was for the guards to get a handle on these guys.
She used her know-how, actually, her accountancy background. She used that to her advantage to be able to follow the money in a very effective way.
Central to her work was a network of confidential informants. One of her more frequent sources was close Gilligan associate, John Traynor.
The relationship between John Traynor and Veronica Guerin no doubt was complex. Traynor was used to playing both sides. Sometimes he would supply good information, sometimes he'd serve completely bogus information designed to have people look the wrong way.
The man who spoke out of both sides of his mouth, he couldn't be trusted. Gardaí didn't trust him. Ultimately, Veronica couldn't trust him. Any journalist who dealt with him couldn't trust him.
In 1995, Veronica Guerin was on her way out to a staff party, actually, in the Sunday Independent. Her husband and her son were out of the house at the time. She heard a knock at the door. She opened the door, and there was a gunman wearing a motorcycle helmet. He pointed the gun at her head and then pointed it down at her leg, and he shot her in the thigh. She spoke openly about this. There were a number of suspects that the Gardaí were looking into in the criminal world, people that she may have been investigating, but it's understood that Veronica Guerin herself, towards the end of her life, suspected that it was John Traynor that ordered this hit, because he wanted criminals that he would have been connected to believe that he wasn't friendly with her, that he wasn't her source.
Through her contact, John Traynor, Veronica Guerin knew that John Gilligan was building a substantial criminal enterprise. So she decided to come here to Jessbrook, where she hoped to interview him. She spoke with Gilligan at the door, but he quickly became nasty and began to assault her. During the attack, he threatened to kill both her husband and her son. Veronica made her escape, but that day her fate was sealed. And 9 months later, the Gilligan gang would murder Veronica Guerin.
This would have been something Veronica would have often employed. This tactic was to go directly to the person she intended.
She handed them all major criminals and all, like, that she was dealing with, and basically said, "Were you the one that shot me?" If you look at the movie, Veronica Guerin, you can see the monk where he goes, "No," he said, "if I shot you, I wouldn't have missed." Like, but it was John Gilligan, like, obviously had her shot, you know.
Tended to write a story about and ask them to talk to her, because oftentimes it was fruitful for her. She had done it with Jerry the Monk Hutch, and he had subsequently given her interviews. This was her approach, to go directly to the person and say, "I believe this is what you're doing. What do you have to say about it?" In this instance, it provoked an extremely angry reaction from John Gilligan.
She claimed that he immediately assaulted her, that he started punching her in the side of the head and face with his fists, that she eventually got back to her car and she collapsed on the ground, and he wasn't finished there. He dragged her and violently placed her back in the car, and she claimed that he then ripped her shirt because he was looking for a wire. Until she eventually managed to get away, and she drove off.
Veronica Guerin, she needed medical treatments, and she obviously thought about her next step, but she went ahead and decided to press charges against Gilligan. Now, for Gilligan, when he was charged, he couldn't countenance the idea of being jailed again for even 6 months, which a man of his record, he would have been looking at that kind of sentence. For him at that stage, as we know now, would have cost millions, and he wasn't prepared to lose that kind of money. So that was certainly setting up some kind of reckoning.
Veronica wasn't going to let it go. It was a savage beating.
He's an the
type of person John Gilligan was, neither was he. And as far as he was concerned, that was her warning. He told her to back off. He told her not to put any articles about him in the Sunday Independent. And the result, I suppose, was a standoff between the two of them. But I suppose nobody at that stage could have anticipated just the vitriol Gilligan had for her, and for anyone trying to expose him in the newspapers and put him out of business and put him back in jail.
Gilligan's cannabis business was booming, and the threat of a prison sentence over the assault of Veronica Guerin was something he wasn't prepared to accept. He sees an opportunity to stop the case from proceeding when John Traynor hands over information about the reporter's movements.
Veronica Guerin had an inkling that John Traynor, the coach, was behind that shooting in 1995 when she was shot in the thigh. So she was very wary of him. She described him as being dangerous and very two-faced, but she continued to treat him as a source. But she was threatening to expose him, and she wanted more information on John Gilligan. And during one of their last meetings, she was talking to John Traynor, and she let it slip that she was due to appear at Naas District Court, and that would have been the 26th of June.
And this information was passed on from Traynor to the Gilligan gang. This was something that Traynor later denied, but Gardaí said in court, and I've no doubt that it was John Traynor who passed that information on to the Gilligan gang, and Traynor was well aware that John Gilligan wanted information about Veronica Guerin's movements because he had sworn revenge against her, essentially.
So all of a sudden, they had a time, date, and place where she was going to be, and obviously that accelerated the plans in the minds of the gang that now was their chance and they could do something about Veronica Guerin once and for all.
While the road layout has changed here, this is the spot where Veronica Guerin was murdered. She'd attended court that day in Naas, where she had been up on a speeding charge, but she'd got a small fine and was happy with the result. She pulled up to a red light and picked up her phone and made a call. With that, a motorbike pulled up alongside her car and a gunman opened fire. It's understood that Veronica died instantly.
I should have close range, point blank.
The murder sparked a massive public outcry, and the resulting investigation was extensive and innovative.
John Gilligan definitely felt like he was untouchable. He was also hugely naive. Himself and his gang members believed they could murder Veronica Guerin, and within a few weeks it would have blown over. They expected a bit of heat, and they didn't anticipate at all the massive public outcry, both from government, Gardaí, and of course the general public. And that was a terribly naive move, and Gilligan was just so focused on revenge. He was so focused on being wronged, as he saw it, by this journalist who was relentlessly pursuing him. So he had blinkers, and he let himself be led by his rage.
It was a massive investigation. There were 100 officers working on the case, 30 investigators. They analysed every criminal that Veronica Guerin had written about, that she had spoken to or interviewed during her time as an investigative journalist, but all the information led back to Gilligan and his gang.
The murder investigation was headed up by Chief Superintendent Tony Hickey, and he brought an incisive level of control and focus to it. He'd studied in Quantico with the FBI and with Scotland Yard and knew how to carry out major investigation of this nature. It was the first time that they used mobile phone tracking to piece together members of the gang to find out who was talking to who, when they were talking. They looked at all the mobile phone traffic on the day of the murder. It was crucial in identifying Russell Warren, who they didn't know. He wasn't known to the guards, and Charles Bowden as well. Neither of these guys had come up on the Garda radar before, and it's quite unlikely any of their underworld informants would have known about them either.
Charlie Bowden, he was a former soldier. He was an expert in guns as a result. He was very interested in guns. He had fallen on hard times. He owed a lot of child support to his first wife. So it's for this reason, kind of out of necessity, he got involved in criminality rather than being brought up as a criminal.
Russell Warren was also part of the gang. He was called the bag man. He was the financial controller, so to speak. So he had a very important job, but he really wasn't respected by John Gilligan. He would have been seen as a weak link.
Neither Bowden nor Warren were hardened criminals in that they'd never served a day in jail. They were very much brought in as backup.
Bowden and Warren are brought in for questioning, and over a number of days they reveal the extent of Gilligan's drug operation and the plot to kill Veronica Guerin.
Well, Russell Warren said that he met Brian Meehan on the morning of the 26th of June 1996, that he handed over the bike to Brian Meehan, that Meehan directed him to go to Naas to look out for a red Opel Calibra car, which was Veronica Guerin's car, because she was due in Naas District Court that day to answer a speeding fine. He said that when he went there, he eventually saw her leaving the court. He said he was in contact by mobile phone with John Gilligan and Brian Meehan all the while. He got into his car, and he said he was about 4 cars behind her as she made her way back to Dublin on the Naas Road. He said he then saw Brian Meehan on the motorbike. He was driving the motorbike with the hitman as a pillion passenger.
Charlie Bowden supplied, cleaned the gun, put the bullets in it and gave it to Dutchy Holland. And it was his evidence to the court that Dutchy Holland was the gunman who murdered Veronica Guerin on that day. Dutchy Holland died in prison in 2009 in the UK. He was serving a sentence for a plot to kidnap a businessman. He had denied the murder, but it was the belief of Gardaí and their evidence as well that he was indeed the trigger man.
Across the country, criminal gangs had become more violent and more brazen in their attacks. A new tool was needed to fight organised crime. And after the murder of Veronica Guerin, public outrage and political will was there in order to fast-track the establishment of the Criminal Assets Bureau. The Bureau was an arm of law enforcement with just one goal: to follow the money.
The death of Veronica Guerin touched so many people in a way that they never thought would be possible, and to see somebody who was doing their job, who was reporting on this type of crime killed in such a way, it spurred people on to want to do something, to want to really get at the very heart of why these people are doing what they're doing.
Within a week of her murder, legislation had been introduced into Dáil Éireann. In fact, it was introduced by opposition justice spokesperson John O'Donoghue, seeking to deal with the illicit gains that gangland criminals were making. And as a result of that, all parties in the Dáil enacted the Proceeds of Crime Act. And that was a huge change to how we deal with organised crime in this country.
The Criminal Assets Bureau was very innovative. We hadn't seen anything like that in Ireland before. And it was obviously necessary because, you know, there was laws there to try and tackle criminals in relation to crimes they had committed. And, you know, the burden of proof was on the Gardaí, as always is the case in these crimes, to try and prove whether a person had committed a crime or not. But there was never anything in the background to focus on how a person was amassing a huge amount of wealth with no obvious means of earning that money.
So it was a key moment that the onus of proof switched from the guards to the criminal.
And John Gilligan was the first cab target who would have to explain how he was able to finance a multi-million euro development in County Kildare.
If you look back at Gilligan and how he accumulated his wealth and what he did with it, we can see that in 1987, he and Geraldine bought a very small little house out in a townland called Mucklawn near Enfield in County Kildare. This little house that he bought in Mucklawn was the beginning of the empire that would end up as a massive equestrian centre.
Jeffbrook, I suppose, was really John Gilligan's vanity project, and it was him showing off to the world how much money he had. It was really his wife, Geraldine, who had the interest in horses much more so than John. He did to an extent, but it was really her world, and she kind of got him involved in it. And then there was such a huge amount of money there that they decided to develop this equestrian centre.
While the Criminal Assets Bureau was proving to be a very significant thorn in Gilligan's side, he had bigger problems.
In the meantime, John Gilligan's gang continued to import drugs right up until October of 1996, but it became more and more difficult for them because they had less money at their disposal, because their assets were being frozen very quickly as CAB was moving in on them. And in October 1996, John Gilligan was approached by officers at Heathrow Airport, and he had £300,000 in his possession.
He was charged in connection with money laundering, and he was held in Belmarsh high security. And he was there until the Irish authorities charged him with the murder of Veronica Guerin. They successfully made the argument in court that the charges in Ireland were more serious and that they therefore should go ahead in Ireland first before his money laundering charges in the UK.
Gilligan fights the extradition for 3 years, but in 2001, he returns to Ireland to stand trial before the Special Criminal Court for the murder of Veronica Guerin.
Following the money laundering charges that were brought against him in the UK, he faced extradition proceedings, but he challenged them for a number of years. But eventually, in February 2000, he was extradited back to Dublin to face a charge of murdering Veronica Guerin and drug trafficking charges. When he was brought back on the plane, he was still in his prison overalls, those yellow and green prison overalls. And when he arrived at the airport, he was furious to see that there were over 20 photographers there to take photographs of him. He was eventually brought to the Special Criminal Court. Apparently, he smirked at reporters when he was there. He had insisted that he wanted to change his clothing before he appeared in the dock there, and the charges were put to him.
Gilligan probably would still have been confident that he was going to be able to avoid being convicted again. There was, at the time, there was 4 main witnesses. These included both Russell Warren and Charles Bowden, but they also included an ex-girlfriend of Gilligan's at the time and one of his Dutch contacts. Now, as it would turn out, 2 of those would be intimidated and felt threatened enough, and they never came to Ireland to actually to give their evidence in court. And in the end, the prosecution had to rely heavily on Bowden and Warren. They basically started the witness protection program for those 2 men. There was incredible scenes in the forecourts down the quays in Dublin at the time. There was snipers on the roof. There was helicopters overhead. There was heavily armed police and guards.
That was the first name or
At the end of the trial, during the verdict, Mr. Justice Dermot O'Donovan said that he was going to treat the evidence of Russell Warren as uncorroborated and unreliable. He said that he had grave suspicions that John Gilligan was involved in ordering and in organising the murder of Veronica Guerin. John Gilligan thought he wasn't going to get much for the drug trafficking charges in terms of a sentence, and he said he was going to be out of there.
Certainly Gardaí were massively disappointed. It was a real blow, they felt, for him not to be convicted of Veronica Guerin's murder. They took some solace in the fact that he was handed down a 28-year sentence for drug trafficking. This was the longest ever sentence in the history of Ireland in relation to a drugs crime. They did take some solace in that. That was reduced to 20 years on appeal, but it was still an extremely lengthy sentence.
Despite insisting he'd never return to prison, Gilligan found himself back in Portlaoise, serving a very long sentence. But behind bars and in the company of some of Ireland's most notorious criminals, he continued to run his drug empire.
During his prison term, that 17-year prison term, Gardaí believed that Gilligan was still trying to operate his drugs empire.
Portlaoise prison is a very different regime to the rest of the Irish prison system. They have a much more relaxed environment. They have a lot more privileges and freedom. So he made a lot more contacts again, particularly with some Limerick criminals, the McCarthy dungeons. He became quite close to them in particular. There was even pictures emerging at one point of him kind of living the high life and partying with some very well-known criminals, including John Daly. So he continued to be a very well-known figure. He was infamous, really, because of his involvement in the Guerin murder.
When the prison gate opened at 9:35, this was the first time Gilligan was seen in public without handcuffs and being chained to a prison officer in almost 17 years. True to form, he appeared to lap up the attention from the awaiting media before getting into a waiting car.
John Gilligan is now a free man, but his time behind bars, where he continued to challenge his detention over and over, is estimated to have cost the taxpayer close to €15 million in legal fees. Where he goes from here will no doubt be monitored closely by the media, but detectives, who've been a thorn in his side for years, will also be hot on his tail, watching his every move.
Following his release in October 2013, his brother had a party for him in Clondalkin.
We knocked on his door, a couple of journalists, and he had just arrived back to his brother's house, and the party was just about to get underway. And we just asked him what he had to say about his release, about Veronica Guerin, about this infamous crime he was accused of.
Accept you?
No, I didn't.
No,
I didn't. And I didn't. And I see people said I admitted this. I didn't know such thing. And another thing is, one of the reasons why I didn't get convicted, especially criminal court at the border, when people said I threatened the lady in an office, we asked at them days, there was no throwaway phones them days. They were all they were all phones, bill phones to your landline. And the court said for 5 days they asked for us to please produce a bill phone there, and we'll know where these threats came from. If he was or if he's in another jurisdiction. And the prosecutor didn't produce any because there was none, because I never made any phone call.
Now a free man, John Gilligan fully expects to pick up where he left off. But the criminal underworld has moved on, and Gilligan finds he's no longer welcome.
When John Gilligan was at his criminal height, I suppose if you want to call it that, in the early and mid 1990s, he was trading in drugs. He had built up a huge reputation as a successful criminal within the ranks of the criminal underworld. He knew a lot of criminals, they would have mixed together, there would have been a lot of collaboration. But after he was released from prison, it was a different landscape he came out to.
He was coming back from a christening. He stopped off at his brother's house in Clondalkin. He had been dropped there by his daughter Tracy. When he was in the house, 2 armed men came into the house and he ran into the toilet, and they fired a number of shots, hitting him in the chest, in the face and in the hip. So he had to undergo surgery that night, and he was given the last rites also.
Look at that.
Even though it had been 17 years, I think the criminal underworld was still very unhappy that basically, because of John Gilligan's, as they saw, reckless actions of murdering a journalist, that they were all still paying the price because CAB was after them every day and every night. They felt when John Gilligan then came out and started immediately trying to throw his weight around, that he didn't know his place and that he should be apologising and he should be remorseful and he shouldn't be making demands of getting back involved in criminality.
It's believed that Gilligan cut a deal with Ireland's top gangland figures to spare his life. But cut off from the drug trade and unable to earn, Gilligan redoubles his efforts to hold on to the few assets he has left.
He tried every trick in the book to try and thwart CAB and to try and keep them away from him. He tried all sorts of legal avenues. He appealed points of law. He appealed the legislation that brought about the Criminal Assets Bureau. He appealed everything. He changed his lawyers. And he was able to do this because he had free legal aid. We paid for all of that. And he persisted and persisted and persisted for more than 21 years to try and stop CAB taking the last of his properties from him.
No matter who the first person was going to be, they were always going to challenge it. But I suppose it was an indication that John Gilligan was the central focus of CAB in its early days, that he was the person who challenged it. But the legislators at the time in Dáil Éireann recognised that this was a piece of legislation that would be challenged in the courts, and they deserve to be commended for drafting the legislation in such a way that it didn't overstep the constitutional mark.
Criminal Assets Bureau first initiated proceedings against John Gilligan and his family in 1996, and in 1997 the High Court granted a Section 3 proceeds of crime application to the Criminal Assets Bureau in relation to that. But then after there followed a multitude of applications and motions by the Gilligan family, and subsequently it was 2017 before the Criminal Assets Bureau was in a position to dispose of the last of the Gilligan family assets. So all the different appeals, all the different motions that they went through, and of course, obviously, we contested them, they appealed them, so proceeded for that length of time. You're looking at basically over 21 years of actions in relation to that.
In 2017, John Gilligan made one final appearance in an Irish court to appeal the decision against the seizure of his assets, which he claimed were not the proceeds of crime. After 21 years of legal challenges, all paid for by the Irish taxpayer, it was up to the Supreme Court to make the final decision.
Before that case, as he was walking into the court that morning, and I was well used to trotting along beside John Gilligan with a microphone in hand, trying to get him to comment on anything he might want to comment on. And he would always just look straight ahead with this kind of a smoked grin on his face and keep walking and never say a word. And then, just as he got to the door, he said to me, 21 years, I've been waiting for this. And I was like, okay, so he's talking now. So we chatted for a while, and it was bizarre because he just kept on going over old court cases and dates and times and where he felt that the cases against him were wrong. and how he had been wronged, and this would be his day where he would finally win. And then out of the blue, I didn't prompt it, out of the blue he started talking about Veronica Guerin without prompting at all. And he said to me, I pray for Veronica, which is a hard thing to hear from a man
Oh my God.
who's the head of the gang that killed her.
Okay.
John Gilligan arrives in with the son and sits at the back of the court, and Geraldine was sitting up behind me with Tracy. And Gilligan was smiling, and he was thumbs up to Tracy and big smile on his face. And I found out afterwards that word had actually got out into the media that Gilligan had won his case. Erroneously, this word got out. Gilligan stood up. He was full sure he had won his case, and he was just waiting for it to be confirmed. So when the judges then said, the case fails, you've lost, floor, and you could see it on the faces of all the cab staff that were there, their elation that finally they had got what they wanted. But the way that John's face changed was incredible.
The Equestrian Centre at Jessbrook, that was taken over in the early 2000s, but it wasn't until 2017 that they finally got the legal orders that she was forced to hand it over. And Gilligan was seen back in the house at that time, and they stripped it bare. They took the fencing, they took electrical fittings. So Gilligan even went on the social housing list claiming he was homeless.
With no Irish assets remaining and a clear message from gangland that he's no longer welcome, a desperate Gilligan heads abroad.
He would have spent time abroad. Spain again became his kind of bolt hole, trying to get things going again.
He was trying to board a plane from Belfast over to Spain, and he had, it was just under 20,000 euro, I think it was around 17,000 sterling in cash. And there was a piece of cardboard with the name of a prescription drug written on it, a drug known as Zimmos.
The detectives involved thought that this money was going to be brought to Spain to buy prescription drugs for illegal resale back in Ireland. Of course, as we found out then earlier this year, that's exactly what he was up to.
Irish assets and a clear message from gangland to stay out of the drug trade. Strapped Gilligan began to sell assets he had hidden in Spain, including a pub called the Judge's Chambers. In 2015, I travelled to Spain, posing as a potential.
Have the bar outside also. This has electric and barbecue inside. It's a beautiful bar.
You own the bar?
It's my bar.
Gilligan's daughter, Tracy, claims she's the owner of the bar. We offer her cash and an opportunity to keep the deal off the books.
That's not a problem. The black money. The price is 450,000. This is the least. This is the price. The mortgage at the moment is for 250. So this is the minimum for the deeds.
Right.
And then the balance of the money is possible black money.
The Gilligan family is no longer associated with the pub, but John Gilligan found it difficult to quietly liquidate his Spanish assets. And in 2019, he went back to his old ways.
In terms of criminality, Gilligan had gone off the radar. Apart from his cab appearances, in court, still wrestling over Jess. I mean, that was about it. It wasn't until, I think in 2018, he was arrested again with a bag of money, this time in Belfast airport. And he had a piece of paper with a Zoppic loan written on it. Those involved thought that this money was going to be brought to Spain to buy prescription drugs for illegal resale back in Ireland. He spent 5 months on remand at the time. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence. But of course, as we found out then earlier this year, that's exactly what he was up to. He was buying Zopiclone and shipping it back on a kind of a mail order business.
On the 25th of October this year, the Spanish National Police announced that they had arrested John Gilligan at a villa in Alicante.
Spanish police had been watching Gilligan at the villa in Los Balcones. The sort of operation he was at would be probably best described as cottage-level industry compared to what he had been in his heyday when he was earning millions. He was certainly in the premiership of European drug dealing.
He used a very unsophisticated, very basic method of basically sending drugs, primarily cannabis and a lot of pills as well, a lot of prescription pills. But he was doing it through the post, through the regular post, and also through couriers. And this was seen as a very, very basic way to get drugs from A to B. It certainly wasn't the John Gilligan, of the 1990s who, was arranging these massive shipments. It was small parcels of drugs.
And very significantly, they showed footage of the police searching a garden. You can see in the footage that they found a handgun.
Spanish authorities initially believed this weapon could be the same gun used to kill Veronica Guerin, but that was quickly proven to be untrue. Regardless, it's a significant find, and if found guilty, will have a huge impact on the length of Gilligan's sentence.
Gilligan hasn't really given an explanation, I suppose, as to why there was a gun buried at his property. It'll be up to the Spanish police now to try and link this gun to him and to try and get a charge on him in relation to this gun. I'm sure it'll be within his powers to deny all knowledge of the gun, but if they can link it forensically to him, he has questions to answer there.
And while we wait for those questions to be answered, John Gilligan languishes in a Spanish prison, a far cry from the party atmosphere he enjoyed in Portlaoise. I caught up with Gerard Cousins, an English journalist based in Spain, to find out more about the conditions in the prison where Gilligan is being held.
He's almost certainly going to be in Foncolén prison. It's an old prison. It's a very overcrowded prison, one of the most overcrowded prisons in Spain. It was built for 450 inmates, and I think it's currently got about 800 inmates there. It was also the prison where, interestingly, the Spain's first prison worker died of coronavirus earlier this year in March. What's happening now is there's an ongoing judicial investigation on bail. Gilligan's the only one who's been remanded in custody, but it won't be before next year. I'm sure that we'll at least next year before we know whether Gilligan's going to be charged. But the evidence seems to be good against him.
What the criminal case is, as of yet, we don't know, but it's a major blow for Gilligan to face another lengthy stretch behind bars at his age as well. And it's a very different environment in Spain, the prison system, to what he would be used to in Portlaoise, where he was John Gilligan. Everybody knew who he was. Everybody, he felt, was impressed by who he was, or should be impressed by who he was. Nobody in Spain knows who this kind of pint-sized Irish old man is, So that could be challenging for him.
There are uncertain times ahead for John Gilligan, but with a strong case being built against him and a long history of criminality, this could be the end of the line for one of Ireland's most notorious criminals. But his crimes and his lengthy legal battles with Gardaí and the Criminal Assets Bureau have had a lasting impact on Irish society.
When we see the recent arrest of John Gilligan in Spain, what it teaches us is that a person may be arrested, may be convicted, may serve a very lengthy time in prison, but sometimes people will revert to criminal activity. And I think the important thing from CAB's point of view is that even though they've been successful with a person previously, I know that CAB will not lose interest in that person simply because they've served a sentence and have been released from prison. If you make the foolish decision to get back involved in criminal activity again, you can be sure that the Criminal Assets Bureau will be keeping a close eye upon you.
And one of the effects that Gilligan's oppositional behaviour to authorities had was that he effectively bulletproofed the legislation for the next generation.
Not only was he the cause of CAB being set up, but he also tested it to the limits legally. And now CAB are in a position where if any appeals wiped away, and CAB can now move forward quite quickly through procedures.
The
organised crime group led by John Gilligan, it led to the establishment of the Criminal Assets Bureau, and it's here forevermore for the community, for the citizens of Ireland, but also it's held up as a gold standard for other agencies globally when they want to establish a similar bureau or unit. They come to us and they reach out to us to see how do we work, what's the training involved, what are the partnerships. how the team room's made up. So it's 25 years later. So we are still working for the people of Ireland, but also reaching out globally to our other law enforcement partners.
So ironically, John Gilligan
had done so in a very public way, behaviour that we won't tolerate this type of activity taking hold of our communities, and where innocent people are really caught in the crossfire.
Right. So that's there. Just
Wednesday, 9:15 at Werburgh Street Labour Exchange.
Intelligent as well.
Martin Cahill arrives to collect the dole.
The doll, that's awesome.
Like the rest in these queues, Martin Cahill has full entitlement to dole money. He claims on a wife and 3 children. Address given, 21 Swan Grove. Personal number GD126702. Unemployment assistance of £92.10p per week, plus £5 fuel voucher.
And the fucked up thing, like, he was going out with, it was obviously mother of children, but he was going out with her sister as well. Like, I just don't know. Weird one. He always had his hand over his face, you know.
Martin Cahill is 38 years old. His Dublin criminal record number 275770. His first conviction was in 1961 at the age of 11, larceny, for which he got probation.
Yeah, but
after a number of similar convictions,
if you look at the movie, The General, you'll see, like, back then he was robbing for food, like, because they were hungry. That's how he started out, robbing, you know. They were poor, like, it's not like he was robbing money and that he was robbing food. But, yeah, enough talk on me.
he got his first term in 1963 for housebreaking, 1 month. 1965, housebreaking and larceny, 2 years. 1970, receiving stolen property, 4 years, with another 4-year and 3-month conviction alongside. 1977, larceny of a motor car, 3 years. This man has come to Garda attention for years. The latest Garda criminal intelligence bulletin on him is dated September 1987. His description is given as Martin Cahill, nicknamed the General. Addresses 17 Cowper Downs and 21 Swan Grove.
Car outside his house.
About
You
armed
say it was
crime and the Garda
diarrhea.
operation that's on at the moment. I just want to get to meet you. I knew you came down here.
Yes, I have a witness here. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Right, I'm Brendan O'Brien. He turns to an innocent bystander to witness my approach.
I've never
on
seen
various things
nobody
about crime and the Garda operation and all of
What
that.
kind of operation?
And I know there's surveillance and all
There's no
that.
surveillance on me.
Well, we're aware that there's
No,
surveillance.
no.
Well, they've been sitting outside your house
No,
and all
not sitting on mine. Jesus.
that. Right, well, anyway. I just wanted to get to meet you. Right? Yeah. His every movement is watched and followed. On the pavement, two detectives walk close. On the road, an unmarked Garda car hovers.
The Rathmines rapist. No, the Garda.
No.
All the women in Rathmines.
All right, you're Martin Cahill, right?
Yes.
You live in 21 Swan Grove.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Right. There are guys sitting outside your house in cars every morning.
Yes, I never see them.
24 hours a day between their cars and wherever you go.
Oh, no, I never see them. Serious, no, I don't see them.
It was funny.
Right, Martin, right. Why does everybody, i.e. the guards and criminal people, say Martin Cahill is the general?
Never, no one ever said it to me.
Well, I'm saying that's what people say. You've seen it in the papers, you've seen it, you've seen it published.
No, what's this? No. It must be someone else. It must be another man's house.
Right, okay, there might be I've no doubt that there is another Martin Cahill, but there isn't another one who lives in 21 Swan Grove under Garda surveillance, right?
I see no surveillance.
Right.
I see nothing.
Yeah. Well, who do you think the general is?
I don't know. Some army officer.
Are you sure there is an army officer called the general? There's also
where the country is these days, you wouldn't know.
Why have the guards circulated notices about Martin Cahill, known as the general, wanted for armed robberies in Mallow and Clonmel and other places around the country? Why have they done that?
Well, it must be because they're trying to blacken me for some reason. Oh, I probably know it. Boy, I blacked it. It's Ned Ryan. I complained about him.
Well, what do you know of the senior police officer who's now under armed protection?
There's no other. No interest in the police, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I've no interest.
Well, what people would say is, why do you draw the dole?
Because I'm unemployed.
Yeah. But your lifestyle doesn't look like a man on the dole.
I'm in Ankle trying to get a job.
You're in Ankle?
Ankle, yes.
Trying to get a job?
Trying to get a job, yes.
Doing what?
Central labour. I'm trying to get a job as a labourer, anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. Why do you walk everywhere with your hand over your face then? What's the point in that?
He studied law and everything on me.
It started about 7 years ago. Detectives then said to me that they're going to put somebody somewhere to accuse me of something. You understand? And they're going to get there to pick me out. Well, I've been doing this for about 7 years.
Your brother got 10 years for the Bellegarde, manager of the Bellegarde pub, beating him with an iron bar.
Bit of crime.
Not all right, but he got 10 years for a serious crime.
Yeah, 10 years.
Eddie. But
10 years.
Well, I thought he got 10 years, 7 or 8 years ago.
Well,
what did he get?
I think he got 7 years.
Well, 7 years, right. 7 years. Well, it was a serious crime.
Oh, yeah.
Well, look, if you take the... I asked Mark Cahill if he knew anything about the Killikee operation on the stolen Rusborough House paintings. There were pictures shown to an art expert, so to speak, from Holland. This was a deal to be done with a Dutch guy.
Not about that. And then you're saying something about 4 roads.
Later, he himself returned to the subject of the paintings. Well,
But I know there's another person who's interested in that. Private detective.
Yeah. Who's interested in the paintings? Yeah. Who's that?
Some private detective.
But who is it though? Or where is he?
And he made me a private detective. find them as well. But I know nothing more about it. I've asked people, and no one knows.
What do you mean they made you a private detective?
I'm a private detective.
You are a private detective?
I work for a company.
You work for a company? What's the company?
The Gill investigation.
Yeah. Right. And what do you do for them?
When there's a job, I ask people like that, he'll ask me, come down, and if I know something about anything like that, you give me a job.
Yeah. Who's that?
Mr. Lynch.
Noel Lynch. Yeah. And you work for him? You call yourself a private detective as well?
Oh, Lynch.
I'm a private detective,
Yeah. Surely that's the joke of the century. I mean, the idea that you're a private detective, when the guards have you under surveillance and they have you listed for all kinds of things. He named another close associate as a private detective. A man who is before the courts for armed robbery.
He's on standby.
You don't mind me laughing, but I do think that's very amusing. Yeah. He's on standby, isn't he, for a job? I know what you're saying. Yeah.
So if there's anything that he wants to say, like some person wants to find something, then he's ready to ask him. Does he know anything about it?
Yeah. I see. And does Martin Foley work for the private detective agency as well?
Yeah.
But back on the subject of the paintings, I asked Martin Cahill if he thought the Gardaí had been outsmarted up in Killikee.
The police are never outsmarted. And if anyone says any different, those police are very, very clever. And it's... You've been rumours that Martin Cahill said that I said it, you're right. You're right. That the police are and all like that. No such thing. I never say anything like that. Because they want to give the impression, right, that there's a big gangster somewhere.
Yeah.
Do you understand? A dangerous man.
Yeah.
That he's frightened and everything. And they're probably believing what they're saying themselves.
They've received a lot of threats on recent days.
Probably their own mate.
Martin Cahill had stood talking on the pavement for an hour and a quarter, all the time with his hand over his face.
Yeah, obviously.
Passers-by wonder at it.
This is the end of this one. So. Yeah, that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed the content. I'll be back. Peace out.